Hello, good morning. It is Thursday, October the 31st, and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about British politics in less than 20 minutes.
It is All Hallows Eve, which means the metaphors write themselves this day after Rachel Reeves' mega budget. My name is Sam Coates from Sky News, and with me is Jack Blanchard of Politico. It's the last one of the week. Don't forget to use the follow button on your podcast app if you just want us to appear on your phone at 7:30 in the morning, every morning from Monday.
I get a special treat because Sam Coates appears on my Zoom screen at 6:30 every morning for this conversation. And Sam, I am rather distraught to peer into my computer and see you very much not sitting in your house today. You are on the road again. I fear this must be a budget mission. Where are you today?
Yes, I am right next to Euston Station. We're about to head up to the West Midlands where Keir Starmer is taking part in a day after the budget series of meetings and interviews and the like. I pressed the no windows button on this hotel room and I've ended up in a basement, and it smells of dank and damp, which is not the kind of Labour Britain that they'll want in 4 years' time. So the question is, will the money that's pouring in everywhere help places like this? I fear not.
Oh my goodness, these things have a no windows button. I could only dream of such wonders. Okay, let's get into the day. Obviously, we're going to be talking about the budget today that Rachel Reeves delivered yesterday, all the fallout, all the reaction. She will be spending the morning doing interviews. We have the event in the West Midlands with Keir Starmer doing clips as well. All the opposition are also out and about. Jeremy Hunt, the shadow chancellor, the two contenders to be leader of the Tory party. And by the way, voting in the Tory leadership contest closes later this afternoon, so we better do a bit on that as well today. But the vast majority of the conversation is going to be about the budget. Sam, how did you spend budget day yesterday? Do you sort of spend it like poring over documents, or are you ringing people? What does a political journalist do you do on budget day?
I mean, largely through the afternoon in the studio. What happens on budget day is you watch the big statement by the chancellor, but you spend most of the time, I do at least, looking at the document produced by the government's independent economic watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, because in a budget, there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of tiny different decisions, and in a lot of cases, massive decisions. And when Rachel Reeves stands up, like all chancellors, she tells you a tiny fraction of the bigger picture story, and certainly only the bits that she wants you to hear. So to get your head around the whole thing, you have to look at the accompanying documentation. So that is what I've been doing last night, and actually since 5 o'clock this morning.
All right, well then let's download a little bit of your brain, shall we? Because I'm sure people want to hear some very big picture stuff. Once you cut through the spin of what Rachel Reeves said in the chamber yesterday, once you cut through the spin of what the opposition is saying about Labour breaking its promises and all the rest, just give us an idea, Sam, of how big this budget was and what it really means once you take 2 or 3 steps back from it all.
So it is a change in the way that Britain is governed. What Rachel Reeves has done is decided to spend £70 billion. That's, for context, a little bit over 2% of our GDP, more than Jeremy Hunt, Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives left behind after 2014. And she has done so by a massive increase in taxes and a massive increase in borrowing. It's about half and half. So of the 70 billion, 36 billion was raised in taxes, 32 billion is raised by borrowing. And the big bet at the heart of this budget is pouring money into parts of public services, and we'll come on to the fact that it's only parts of public services, is going to cause a material difference to people's lives. And at the next election, they can say that they have begun to fix the foundations of things like the NHS, and that this was pain worth experiencing now for gain later. But that independent watchdog was the OBR, which the Labour Party have talked so much about and reached as a friend for the last few years, particularly after Liz Truss declined to consult the OBR before her infamous mini-budget, was not the friend particularly of Rachel Reeves yesterday, because you look at the big headline judgments that they made, and all over the place, there's quite a challenging picture. So on growth, this budget, and it is a budget for growth, and this is a government whose first priority is growth. It says that whilst the budget policies, pouring money in temporarily boost growth in the short term, it leaves GDP largely unchanged in 5 years. So that's the time of the next election. As to the question of whether or not people are better off, well, it says that people's disposable income is up a little bit over the forecast period, the 5 year period, but is lower by the time you get to 2029, the point of the next election, than it had been when they last did their forecast, due in large part to the massive increase in national insurance for employers. And there is a complicated picture on public spending that we'll come to in a moment, with money pouring into the NHS in the short term, but questions about quite what happens in the second half of this parliament, and extraordinarily questions about whether or not it's enough coming further down the track.
Yeah, and that's the sort of weird paradox at the heart of the budget, isn't it? That all this extra money is going into public services, but almost all of it is being spent pretty quickly, and it does raise questions about where we're going to end up further down the parliament. And you've heard that from the Institute for Fiscal Studies in their initial verdict. Similar concerns being raised by the Resolution Foundation overnight. Those are the two main economic think tanks that people look to for reaction to the budget, both seen as reasonably impartial. They both have events this morning, and everyone in Westminster will be watching closely for what they say. The Resolution Foundation have put out some of their work in the last few minutes, Sam, and they're pointing out that investment in the National Health Service accounts for 40% of the overall day-to-day public spending increase, and that by 2026 the health budget will account for 42% of all departmental spending. Britain is becoming a health service with a state attached to it. But there's no suggestion really from people within the healthcare sector that what Rachel Reeves has done is somehow a magic bullet, that somehow this is going to solve the NHS crisis, and that somehow, that's going to be the end of the story. And you do wonder where a budget like this is going to leave her in a couple of years' time, particularly, as you say, because the OBR growth forecasts are not exactly suggesting there's some sort of sunlit upland waiting for in a couple of years' time to come and save the day.
There is a shift in the way that the government appears to be approaching the NHS, just as there was a shift in their economic approach. So in the election campaign, they said they were only going to put substantial amounts of money into public services if there was growth, that they weren't going to tax and spend, tax, borrow and spend. Now, tax, borrow and spend is exactly what they have done. But there's a second shift. Time and again, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and others said that that if you are going to put big sums in, that is because you want to reform public services, and reform went hand in hand with money. Well, at this budget, you've got the money, but, for instance, when you've got dealing with the NHS, we don't have a sense of what the reform plan is. In fact, it is months before we're going to get the blueprint for NHS reform, yet the cheque has already been written. And the question is then, is the money that has been agreed and put in today, and it's over 20 billion for over the next 2 years for the NHS, which is a huge sum, is that just to fund day-to-day operations in the NHS, as it seems to be, or will any of it be put aside in order to pay for what will be an expensive transition of services moving from hospitals and closer to the local community, a process that will cost money, because in effect, in order to do that, you're going to have to run both at the same time for a period while you transition from one to another and pay staff to move, right? That's all costly. I don't think that's baked in. And it's notable that this isn't even being branded a budget for the NHS. There was a fascinating Times story just suggesting that ministers thought that it couldn't quite be called a budget for the NHS, simply because the challenge in the NHS was so big, you hadn't filled every bit of the hole. So that is one of the big sort of pressures that still exist despite that vast amount of money.
Let's talk about some of the risks inherent here for Rachel Reeves, Sam. The first one that strikes me is that there was a lot of chatter before the budget, of course, about whether Labour was breaking its promises, particularly around national insurance, and there was this sort of dancing on a head of a pin around national insurance. Of course, it's the employers' end of the contributions that have gone up, as we expected, and they claim that doesn't break the manifesto. But the broader picture of a chancellor who was literally saying a matter of months ago, we don't need higher taxes, what we need is growth. I don't want to and I have no plans to increase any taxes beyond those which we've already set out. It is very, very hard to square that with the scale of what Rachel Reeves announced yesterday. Whether or not you're pro higher taxes, pro bigger state, whatever your politics, it is hard to square this with a chancellor who is being remotely honest, or a shadow chancellor then being remotely honest with the public before the election. And I think that message will get out there, even if you're somebody who, gets paid by paycheck, won't feel these tax rises very directly, when your paycheck comes at the end of the month. Nevertheless, it's impossible really to see this as anything other than a Labour Party that was not being at all square with the public about their plans. And that is a big political risk for them going forward.
Rachel Reeves did a round of interviews yesterday, just doing more imminently. And there was an excellent one with, and I would say that, wouldn't I? But there was an excellent one with my colleague Beth Rigby. And Rachel Reeves did not look comfortable on this point. Basically, she's blaming the Tories. But the picture there is mixed. And just the body language and the kind of the essentially stonewalling approach did not look like a chancellor that was enjoying the main line of questioning on this subject. And, you ask about risks. There are quite a lot of them, and this is what comes through page after page after page in the Office of Budget Responsibility report. So one of the things it talks about, Rachel Reeves is raising most Whitehall budgets by 1.5%, which is less than we expected, and it does mean that actually it implies cuts to some unprotected departments. And if you go through, it sketches out to the end of the Parliament what it thinks is and isn't paid for implied in the numbers. And so these are areas which the government's going to have to come back and ask for more money. So the OBR assumes, for instance, that there isn't enough money in this budget to pay for taking defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. That's going to require an additional 10.3 billion. It assumes that isn't in there. It assumes that post 2026, the picture on public services is back to be tough again. So core school spending for the second half of this Parliament is flat per pupil. In other words, isn't rising. That does not feel like a sustainable position for a Labour Party for whom I remember once Rachel Reeves saying education was her top priority. Now it's health. But school budgets flat and not rising per pupil does not feel sustainable. There is no timetable for their promise to get the aid budget back to 0.7%. It sticks at 0.5%. And that after she spent £70 billion and has left no money. There is no money left after this. One of the things that surprised the markets was that she left a smaller than expected amount of wiggle room, headroom, the gap between her self-imposed limits on day-to-day spending, just £10 billion, which is less than many chancellors have left themselves in recent years, less than the markets were talking about, and we felt we were guided. If there is no growth, and growth is anemic by any standards, according to the OBR, over the next 5 years, it's hard to see where the money comes from for these other things that I just listed.
Yeah, and the growth forecast in the OBR report, obviously far from what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer were promising us they were planning to deliver as a government for growth. We heard all those speeches both before and after the election, and lots of the newspapers leading on that today, suggesting that in fact it's these big tax and borrowing rises that have stifled potential growth. I would just say, though, some of the newspapers going in very hard on that today. The Daily Mail's literal opening front paragraph on its front page going in on the OBR growth forecast are the very same newspapers that have been rubbishing OBR growth forecasts day after day for year after year, because of course OBR growth forecasts are not exactly gospel, as indeed I read in the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and everywhere else. These things are frequently wrong, and what Labour will say is that they have supply side reforms coming, a big shake-up of planning coming. None of that is factored in by what the OBR is saying, and they will say that they can still deliver the growth they need. And if they do that, of course, there'll be more money coming into the coffers, and they will use that to fill the holes in public spending further down the line that you're talking about, Sam. The other thing to say is that the amount Britain is now paying in debt interest is absolutely colossal sums of money, and therefore shifts in interest rates over the next few years can affect that massively, potentially on the downside, meaning Rachel Reeves is going to have an even bigger problem, but also potentially on the upside, and maybe there's more money to spend spend in the latter half there. So all I would say about all these forecasts is there is a lot of uncertainty about where Britain is going to be at in 2028, and that's without any sort of black swan style events, pandemics, wars, all those sort of things that we've seen over recent years that can also affect all this stuff massively.
If you get bigger cuts to interest rates than currently expected, then it could well be that the growth picture is substantially better. But if you get Trump in the White House, a tariff war with the US, oil prices raising in the Middle East, then the picture is much more tricky. Look, couple of hidden nasties. This is going to be a budget where we find out about hidden nasties today and in the days to come. There's a big row with the farming community, which was one part of the electorate that actually Labour did very well on before the election. But they feel they have been hit incredibly hard by a new limit to £1 million of the amount of inheritance tax relief you can get for farms. Basically, they say it makes it very hard to leave your farm to your kids. The National Farmers Union are calling it a disastrous budget. You've got Jeremy Clarkson, Kirsty Allsop weighing in and saying that this decision has shown government has a zero understanding of what matters to rural voters. So I think things like that are going to play out. Another one that will affect a lot of people is there is a reduction in the amount of subsidy to the railways. You've already got the government saying that they're going to raise rail prices by 1% above inflation. But if passenger numbers do not increase as they're currently projected, then I think they go up even further. That's according to the OBR. And then just one lovely stat. The chancellor decided not to raise fuel duty yesterday / gave into the Sun's 14-year campaign. The OBR says the cumulative cost of freezing fuel duty since 2010 has been £100 billion. That's the budget, more than the budget of most government departments.
A couple of others for you as well. The aid budget is going to see an de facto £2 billion cut because previous budgets were topping it up and the top up has disappeared. There will be lots of Labour people who don't like that. And big increases in vehicle excise duty for some vehicles. That's the sort of the bitter end of the pill for those delighted that the fuel duty has been frozen. There's lots more of these little nuggets if you go through all the documents. And as you say, some of them might blow up. The farming one is the one that's getting most traction at the moment, mainly because celebrities are wading in on it. I mean, you do wonder how much Labour is worried about farmers with £1 million properties being able to pass them on to their children. It's not very Labour politics traditionally, where they get most of their support in more urban areas. Maybe they're happy to have this row, or maybe it's going to completely blow up in their face, and this is the one they're going to end up having to backtrack on over the weeks ahead. We'll just have to see how that plays out. Let me just return to this Resolution Foundation stuff that they've just put out, Sam, because there's a couple of other really important things to talk out in terms of their projections, most notably about real household disposable income. They're crunching the numbers on what the OBR documents say, and this is really important. This is how much money people feel like they've got in their pockets, and the growth forecasts for this over the Parliament are absolutely tiny. Growth of 0.5% a year on average across the Parliament. That is one of the lowest ever. It will be the lowest, the worst term for living standards improvements under any Labour government since these records began in the 1950s. And these, of course, are people who have already been feeling almost no wage growth for years and years and years. Something like real terms wages will have gone up by about 13 quid over 20 years. So people's wages have just not been going up for a long time now. And that, in the end, has fueled a lot of the discontent we've seen in this country, fueling things like Brexit, fueling things like support for further left and right parties. And you do wonder if this just is going to continue. And this is the picture for the UK now, where people's living standards are just not improving under a Labour government any more than they were under a Tory government. You just wonder where those people are going to go in terms of their politics and what that means for smaller parties looking to capitalise on this sort of thing if Rachel Reeves can't find a way of improving that picture.
And the consequence of that, and the thing that the markets are now watching for, is whether, incredibly, after yesterday, she is then under pressure to spend more in order to help more. One contact who works in hedge fund land said what the markets really want to know after yesterday's is there going to be pressure for more spending, and that is the thing that will determine whether or not the cost of borrowing goes up. It blipped up yesterday, but if it's going to go up more, that'll be because the markets think that Rachel Reeves can't hold the line from here on in.
So we haven't got time to talk about the Tories. Let's do 30 seconds just to say that the Tory leadership contest does close at 5 p.m. tonight. So the voting is almost done. Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick are doing their final rounds of interviews today, trying to gather up those last few votes. Nobody really knows what's happening in this contest. We think turnout was low and expected. We think Kemi Badenoch's in front according to all the old polling that we've got, but we don't really know. The winner will be announced at around 11 o'clock on Saturday morning. So by the time that me and Sam return to your airwaves on Monday morning next week, we will be talking about a new leader of the opposition, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Certainly will. We'll see you then. See you on Monday.
Bye-bye.